Hey everyone, today we're back to talk about Brother Voodoo in the 90s as he was depicted in Marvel Comics. This includes a brief appearance in a Daredevil comic, some pretty hefty stuff with Ghost Rider as he fights a villain called Scarecrow, bizarrely enough, and then finally, a pretty significant special issue with Blade. One day in New York City, Matt Murdock was trapped by a powerful witch named Calypso, who imprisoned the superhero soul within a jar and bound the man into her service. Under her control and transformed into a pale, partially zombified version of himself, Murdock tried to take his mind off of things by watching TV. He saw Brother Voodoo appear on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno. Unusually cheerful, Jericho played to the audience in an effort to sell his book, Do You Voodoo? I Do. He then went on to explain some basic voodoo beliefs, including that a soul has two halves. The gros bon ange represents a person's will, symbolized by their shadow. The tau bon ange is their conscience, symbolized by the penumbra. This matched Murdock's experiences, as he had lost his willpower to resist Calypso, but maintained his sense of conscience. On TV, Jericho Drumm then went over two different types of zombie. The first is a simulated type of undead created through chemical substances. Jericho himself once nearly fell victim to it, and it currently had a hold on Matt Murdock. But luckily, victims of this form of zombification can be restored to human form. Then there is the more traditional, pure, and dangerous form of the Walking Dead, including a famous version of that form known as Simon Garth. Suddenly, Jericho's spirit leapt out of the television screen Matt was watching, warning Murdock that Calypso was trying to create one of the Walking Dead, and begged Daredevil to stop her. Though Murdock struggled with the control Calypso exacted over him, he eventually broke free enough to confront her. The witch ultimately perished in the struggle that followed, when the zombies she was creating broke free and turned on her, while Murdock barely escaped the encounter with his life, as the witch's headquarters collapsed around him. With that, Daredevil returned to human form, but remained convinced that Calypso very likely could have survived the encounter. By this time, Drumm had been spending some time away from Haiti and his identity as Brother Voodoo. He soon became plagued with nightmarish visions of people being murdered by voodoo magic. Speaking out to him for the first time, Daniel Drumm's spirit warned his brother that the two of them would continue to experience visions of these deaths until they put an end to them. So though Jericho agreed to look into this matter, he still refused to take out the name Brother Voodoo. Jericho sought out a man named Danny Ketch, who was also looking into these deaths. Drumm explained to Ketch that Daniel Drumm's spirit had come into contact with a lost soul, somehow involved in all of this, though Jericho remained rueful that he seemed unable to escape the life of wielding magics against the forces of evil. Hearing this, Danny decided to seek out another ally, one already familiar with Jericho Drumm, the living vampire Morbius. The trio encountered a shaman who had taken control of a powerful zombie that was so strong it was able to wield the mystically empowered chains of Ghost Rider against him. Jericho called upon Daniel's spirit and asked him to possess the shaman. This worked, and at once the zombie collapsed. Daniel, having now read the shaman's mind, relayed his history, revealing the man's name was Ellery Snow. Ellery once worked with a private detective named Nathaniel Mare back in the 1950s. Mare was captured by a villain named Cole Rennie, also known as Professor Viper, after the detective was betrayed by a few then high-ranking members of New York society. They killed Nathan and blamed the murder on Ellery, who was imprisoned for years. Now, 40 years later, Ellery was freed and began a crusade of revenge against those that betrayed him and Nathan, resurrecting Mare's body and forcing it to help him out with his plan. Luckily, Ghost Rider, Morbius, and Jericho were able to stop Nathaniel's zombie from killing a woman, who, though she was around at the time of Nathaniel's death, was completely innocent in what happened to Mare and Snow. Though the trio confronted Nathan, he revealed his control had returned over himself after Ellery was possessed, and he just wanted to speak to this woman one last time before he died. Though the group was well aware this didn't make anything right, they took some comfort in the thought that the departed spirits had been put to rest. Now firmly no longer interested in being Brother Voodoo, Jericho began focusing on destroying the undead on his own terms, much to the disapproval of Daniel's spirit. He wound up teaming up with Lilith the vampire, the sole known daughter of Dracula. Tracking down a number of bodies stolen from a cemetery, they came upon an auto junkyard, where they were attacked by a swarm of magically controlled birds. These birds were controlled by a villain called the Scarecrow, a villain given strange augmented powers that feed off the fears of others. He faced and was defeated by Ghost Rider, but his spirit survived and went on to possess the body of Danny's deceased sister, Barbara Ketch. Jericho was rendered unconscious by the attack, only to be woken later by Daniel's spirit. The blood from the animal attacks nearly overwhelmed Lilith's vampire nature, and she was compelled to briefly attack Drumm before he managed to calm her down, having learned how to quell her need for Bud safely in the time they had been working together. On doing so, Lilith took off on her own. While chasing the vampire, Drumm ran into Danny Ketch, who had by then become possessed by Scarecrow himself. Jericho managed to subdue the Scarecrow and tried to interrogate him, but the spirit possessing Ketch used visions of Lilith turning on Jericho to take mystic control over the man, nearly giving the villain the opportunity to slay Drumm outright. Fortunately, Jericho was saved thanks to Daniel's spirit intervening, giving Jericho a chance to break free of the Scarecrow and temporarily incapacitate the villain. Drumm then rushed off to stop Lilith from hurting anyone, saving Danny Ketch's family in the process. This allowed for the Scarecrow to catch up, knock out Drumm, and once again almost use Danny's body to kill Jericho Drumm, only for the Ghost Rider spirit to emerge in Barbara's body. Seizing this opportunity, Daniel Drumm possessed his brother, grabbed Danny Ketch's possessed body, and allowed for the Scarecrow spirit to finally be sent to hell by the Ghost Rider. In the end, Danny was successfully restored as the Ghost Rider, and the Scarecrow was finally defeated, but it came at great cost, deeply traumatizing Danny's mother, nearly killing Ketch's brother, and being a generally unpleasant and painful experience for Danny himself. Jericho could do little more than move on. He was next contacted through fax by a superhero named She-Hulk and a woman named Miss Arbogast on behalf of a team they were part of at the time called Heroes for Hire. Drumm, now once again embracing the identity of Brother Voodoo, was treated with skepticism by a number of the heroes, including a woman named Misty Knight and a man named Luke Cage, though he was greeted warmly by Arbogast, who knew Drumm and even had a cup of tea prepared for his sudden arrival by mystic teleportation. Jericho was called in to treat a badly injured Danny Rand, a man who had taken on the identity of a powerful superhero known as the Iron Fist. It was easy for Brother Voodoo to diagnose Danny as having consumed his own life force. Rand needed a transfusion of spiritual energy, and even though they were skeptical of all this, Cage and Knight readily offered to help, along with fellow hero for hire Colleen Wing. Together they began a ceremony to complete the transfusion, joined by a fourth member of the Heroes for Hire, codenamed White Tiger. The ritual was particularly delicate. One wrong move on Jericho's part, and either Danny or the Heroes for Hire spirit donors could have been killed. Nevertheless, Jericho succeeded and managed to save the life of Danny Rand without incident. With the Iron Fist restored, Drumm was then invited to enjoy a discreet moment of pleasure with Miss Arbogast, away from the others. Not long after this, the acclaimed vampire hunter known as Blade arrived in New Orleans. He came here on news that one of the worst undead beings the vampire hunter had ever faced, a sinister, demonic being known as Deacon Frost, had taken over a crime family in the city, and the vampires were now eyeing every other major settlement across America with the intention to do the same. Blade found it difficult rooting out the undead in this city, with him doing little more than making himself a target, as no civilian wanted to talk to him about what was going on in New Orleans. Eventually, Blade was able to track down Jericho Drumm for help, but only after some vampires began to follow the man. Though Drumm had returned to the identity of Brother Voodoo and abandoned his partnership with Lilith the vampire, he was still quite bitter over the idea of being a superhero and Bamboo's death, and thus was not happy to see Blade. Jericho was aware of Deacon's presence in the city, but pointed out that Frost had taken over a single crime family and begun a relatively small gang war. To Brother Voodoo, there were much bigger threats out there at the time menacing New Orleans. one of Jericho's old enemies, Marie Laveau, had returned, and Jericho, having already lost Bamboo to the evil woman, and knowing full well what sort of vampiric horrors the woman was capable of unleashing, was fully focused on taking out the powerful sorceress. So Drumm refused to help Blade whatsoever. The vampire hunter tersely reprimanded this decision, calling Jericho selfish and questioning his reputation as a superhero. He left, but did come to immediately regret these words, acknowledging that Brother Voodoo had, at this time, taken up mystic protection of the entire city on his own. It would be stressful for anyone, but the added threat of Marie Laveau, who Blade was well aware was a powerful immortal, known as the Voodoo Queen of New Orleans, would be a serious problem even for the likes of Doctor Strange. Blade was also aware of Daniel's spirit living within Jericho's body, having apparently witnessed Brother Voodoo's powers firsthand in the past during undisclosed events, and was empathetic towards the man for having to live with something like that. Blade was then ambushed by vampires, who nearly got the jump on him. An associate of his, Hannibal King, appeared. Hannibal, a vampire detective actively fighting against his vampiric nature and the undead world, was eager to assist in taking out Deacon Frost. Meanwhile, Marie Laveau, calling upon Loa, including Baron Samedi and Damballa, two Loa Jericho had faced in the past, began a spell to create new Zombies under her command. She was confronted by Jericho but was ready for Drumm, and called upon her new allies, Deacon Frost's vampires. Jericho woke up on a ship beside Blade and Hannibal, who had been captured by Frost. Deacon and Marie revealed they had made a deadly alliance, and had firm plans to spread vampirism across the entire world of America. An item called the Grizzly's Pouch was placed around Jericho's neck, disorienting the Voodoo Master and preventing Daniel from leaving his brother's body. With him unable to help the heroes out and Hannibal weakened by garlic, Blade was forced to engineer their escape. Now free, Jericho attacked Marie's Zubembis with a savage fury, hell-bent on taking revenge against Marie on behalf of Bamboo. Drumm took on Marie alone, while the vampire hunters went after Deacon. During the battle, Jericho called out to the Loa empowering Marie, and was able to convince them to remove the powers they bestowed upon her. The end result was Marie and the ship they were on erupted into flames, and the heroes barely escaped with their lives. Whether or not Marie survived this encounter was unclear at the time, but with no sign of her, Jericho set out to inform the relatives of those killed by this evil sorceress. Blade and Hannibal went off for one final showdown against Deacon Frost, who they successfully defeated, but were unable to kill. With New Orleans saved, the vampire hunters left, without another word to Jericho Drumm. Next up, Jericho Drumm's going to work with another new superhero, one that he had a flirting encounter with before, the legendary King of Wakanda, Black Panther.